It begins with a contradiction that almost no one questions. The United States tells the world that free markets decide everything, yet the most powerful forces shaping those same markets operate in rooms the public never sees. This contradiction is not accidental. It is engineered, and it has allowed a handful of elite American institutions to influence global markets without most people ever realizing it. But the real mystery is not how they gained this power. It's why they needed it in the first place, and that answer lies buried in a century of carefully orchestrated decisions. Most people believe America's economic power rests on innovation, productivity, or the sheer size of its economy. Those things matter, but they're not the core. The core is controlled control of information, control of liquidity, control of global trust, and while politicians come and go, the institutions that hold this control almost never change. The Federal Reserve, Wall Street banks, think tanks, and policy groups operate as if they are permanent fixtures of the global order, and yet their origins are far more fragile and secretive than textbooks admit. To understand how America built this economic influence, you have to go back to the early 20th century, when financial chaos pushed politicians into the arms of private power. After the Panic of 1907 nearly collapsed the American banking system, a group of powerful bankers gathered secretly on Jekyll Island to design what would become the Federal Reserve. This wasn't a democratic debate. It was a response to fear that without a central coordinator, America would lose control of its financial destiny. That fear set the first cause-and-effect chain into motion. Once it created, the Federal Reserve didn't merely stabilize markets. It began shaping them. When the Fed expanded credit in the 1920s, it fueled the stock market boom when it tightened abruptly. The boom became the crash of 1929. Millions lost everything, but the institution created to stop panic had quietly become the institution capable of causing it. In the aftermath, political leaders blamed greed, speculation, and the average American investor. But behind closed doors, it was clearer. The levers of economic power had already slipped away from public accountability. The Great Depression didn't just change the economy, it changed who controlled the story. Institutions like the Fed and Treasury gained more authority, Wall Street banks consolidated power, and policymakers learned a timeless lesson: if you control the crisis, you control the reforms. When World War II ended, America controlled 2/3 of the world's gold. That fact alone allowed the U.S. to craft a financial system with the dollar at its center. The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 created the IMF and World Bank, tying global currencies to the dollar. On paper, this was about stability. In reality, it ensured that American institutions would oversee the lifeblood of global markets, capital flows. The world accepted this because it needed rebuilding, and America had the only functioning economy. But quietly, another pattern began. Every major American economic decision triggered global consequences. When the U.S. ran deficits, other nations adjusted their reserves. When the U.S. printed money, other nations faced inflation. And when America made mistakes, others paid the price. That dynamic hit its first breaking point in 1971, when Nixon ended the gold standard. The dollar became fully fiat, backed by trust rather than metal. But trust didn't come from the public, it came from institutions. From that moment onward, the Federal Reserve's decisions mattered more than Congress. Wall Street's influence over global investment surged, and U.S. policymakers learned they could shape the world with interest rates, not armies. Through the 1980s, deregulation transformed finance into a high-speed machine. Wall Street figured out that risk could be packaged, sold, and resold. Hidden inside this new financial architecture was a deeper truth. Complexity benefits those who understand the system, not those stuck inside it. Financial institutions grew larger, more global, and more politically connected. As American banks consolidated into megabanks, their influence seeped into policymaking. Think tanks, like the Council on Foreign Relations and the American Enterprise Institute, shaped narratives. Policy groups like the Trilateral Commission influenced strategy. If elected officials hesitated, there were always experts waiting to fill in the decisions that shaped the world economy. Then came 2008, the moment that exposed everything. When the housing bubble burst, the U.S. financial system nearly collapsed, But the public saw only the surface. They saw Lehman fall, markets crash, and panic spread. What they didn't see was that the Federal Reserve secretly provided over $16 trillion in emergency loans to banks worldwide. Loans most Americans still don't know about. Much of this went to private institutions with deep U.S. ties, institutions whose influence grew stronger after the crisis they helped create. The cause-and-effect chain tightened. The more the Fed intervened, the more markets depended on intervention. The more Wall Street expanded, the less room there was for small businesses. The more policymakers claimed the system was free and fair, the more it relied on backroom decisions, emergency tools, and institutional power. In the 2010s, America's financial dominance strengthened, but not because the system became healthier. It strengthened because other countries became even more dependent on the U.S. dollar. Nearly 88% of all global currency trades now involve the dollar. More than half of all global debt is issued in dollars. And when U.S. interest rates rise, economies from Turkey to Argentina to Pakistan feel the consequences long before American voters do. But even with all this influence, the elite institutions shaping markets still operate without public understanding. Few people know how the Federal Reserve's overnight repo operations affect global liquidity. Few understand how BlackRock's Aladdin algorithm influences $21 trillion worth of assets. Few realize that 3 American credit rating agencies effectively decide how expensive it is for countries to borrow money. The contradiction is obvious once you see it. The system calls itself free, yet its outcomes are engineered by institutions the public doesn't elect, doesn't oversee, and often doesn't even know exist. Then came 2020. The pandemic forced another wave of intervention, larger than anything in American history. The Federal Reserve printed the equivalent of 20% of all dollars ever created in a single year. The stock market rose, while millions lost jobs. Tech giants soared, while small businesses died. And again, behind every major decision were the same institutions guiding liquidity, capital flows, and investor behavior. The fallout from that era is still unfolding. Inflation surged, asset bubbles formed, debt exploded, but instead of reform, institutions doubled down. The same policymakers who oversaw decades of volatility now promised stability. The same financial actors who benefited from crises now warned about new ones. Attempts at reform repeatedly failed because reform threatens power. When lawmakers proposed breaking up banks, lobbyists intervened. When economists suggested limits on monetary expansion, markets panicked. When countries proposed alternatives to the dollar, their own financial systems wobbled. And so the chain continued. Crisis, intervention, consolidation, dependency. Now America faces a new phase 1, where its influence is still strong, but the cracks are widening. The national debt exceeds $34 trillion. The Fed's balance sheet is swollen. Wealth inequality is at a 100-year high. And yet markets continue rising as if nothing is wrong because they trust or hope that the same elite institutions will step in again when trouble comes. But here is where the mystery from the beginning finally connects. Those institutions weren't created to ensure fairness. They were created to prevent collapse. And in preventing collapse, they gained the power to define what stability even means. That is why markets move before announcements are made. That is why global capital reacts to American decisions instantly. That is why the public feels the effects of policies they never voted for. The real contradiction is that the U.S. financial system promises freedom while being quietly managed by a network of institutions that rely on secrecy, complexity, and influence. This doesn't mean the institutions are evil or conspiratorial. It means they are powerful. And power, when hidden, shapes the world more than any election ever could. Look at today's statistics. The top 1% of Americans now control more wealth than the bottom 90%. 3 banks hold nearly half of all U.S. deposits. 5 tech companies control more data than most governments. And every major shift in markets, from rate hikes to oil prices to cryptocurrency, ties back to policies made in U.S. boardrooms, not public forums. The pattern is undeniable. America acts, the world reacts. America prints, the world absorbs. America tightens, the world contracts. And through it all, elite institutions remain the constant force behind the scenes, shaping outcomes with absolute precision. This doesn't mean the future is predetermined, but it does mean the world is entering a phase where understanding these institutions is no longer optional. If the past century revealed anything, it's that the decisions made in these hidden rooms eventually touch every paycheck, every grocery bill, every national budget, and every global market. The first key takeaway is that influence does not require visibility. Institutions shape markets most powerfully when the public eye. The second is that crises don't weaken American institutions. They strengthen them, giving them new tools, new authority, and new global reach. And the third is that America's economic power is built not on money alone, but on the systems that decide where money flows. No one knows how long this system will hold. No one knows what the next crisis will reveal. But one thing is certain. The world is entering a decade where economic power will matter more than ever, and the institutions steering that power will shape not just markets, but nations. If you found this eye-opening and want to understand more of the forces shaping our world, consider staying connected, exploring more of these stories, and preparing yourself for the economic future unfolding right now.